Welcome. My name is Esther Charlesworth, and with Dr. Judy Rogers, we run this Master of Disaster Design and Development degree here at RMIT that sits within the Landscape Architecture program within the School of Architecture and Design. So tonight, I'm delighted to present this lecture, Disaster Design and Development, the complex task of housing refugees after conflict. That will be presented and discussed by two of my favourite humanitarians, Brett Moore, a great friend, supporter and mentor, but more importantly, Brett is Chief of Shelter and Settlements at the UNHCR and has come here via last speaking Mali, Mauritania, Mosul and lots of other places. And Julian Burnside, who will respond to Brett. Julian, as you all know, is a prominent barrister and human rights advocate. So just a few words on MoDDD before we start. MoDDD is the first global degree that's actually situated within an architecture school that focuses on all phases of the disaster management cycle. So we're bringing together disaster and development studies. It's very much built on industry partnerships that we already have made with the International Federation of the Red Cross, UN Habitat, Red R, World Vision, hopefully soon UNHCR. And this lecture comes at the end of a 4-day intensive on shelter and settlement that the MoDDD students have just been doing, 3 days of that up in Marysville. So I think that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Brett. Can I just ask that you please turn your phones off in respect to the speakers that have come here tonight? And I have great pleasure in introducing Brett Moore.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Esther, for your kind welcome and introduction. It gives me great pleasure to be here this evening. I've had the pleasure of being involved with MoDDD for the last 4 or so years, and I do recall at one point Esther talking about the idea of beginning a master's degree that could cover off a whole lot of interdisciplinary issues. So it's wonderful to see that it's come to fruition, and we're nearly at the first year of the degree, so I think that that's a great achievement. So I'll begin by congratulating Esther and RMIT for their forward-thinking and progressive stance on a broad-based education that brings architects out of their shell and maybe looking at some more holistic and global issues. So tonight I'll speak to you around housing, disaster, settlements and conflict, all within the context of refugees. As Esther mentioned, my job is as Chief of the Shelter and Settlement Section with UNHCR in Geneva. Within that role, we have to work around a lot of complicated and interrelated issues. Just to give you some key global figures within which we're working at the moment, the global context is that there's around 65 million people displaced. Now, this is the largest number since World War II. Of that number, there's around 21 million refugees. And of these, around 16 million are actually under the care of UNHCR. UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, has the specific mandate to look after the protection of refugees globally. No other organisation has that mandate. Every minute there are 24 people displaced. And we now know that displacement is a chronic issue. Recent data from ODI shows that, in fact, we are now living in a more peaceful time than at many years in the past, but the conflicts that exist are protracted. War now goes on for longer than ever in history. The top countries that are hosting refugees, as you can see here, are mostly related to the current Syria crisis. Turkey has a disproportionate job on its shoulder at the moment. More than 2.5 million people are in Turkey as refugees. This includes predominantly Syrians, but also others as well. And you can see the other countries up there also. Pakistan with Afghans, Lebanon with Syrians, Iran, Ethiopia and Jordan. The next set of figures that I'll show to help kind of illustrate the context within which we work, where are these people? So they're not knocking on the door of Australia or America. Most refugees are actually in the Middle East, and you can see there. Where do the people come from? Somalia, Afghanistan and Syria, and probably more recently, South Sudan. Really since July last year, since July the 16th, more than 1.2 million people have left South Sudan. And this is not something that you'll see on the headlines every day. It's a complex emergency. And when I say complex, I mean complex in many senses of the word. We use the word complex to describe an emergency that includes conflict and natural disaster elements. And as some more research has recently shown also, the nature of conflict often has its roots in natural disaster. They cannot be easily separated from each other. I'll now take you through some of the projects and the approaches that we use at UNHCR, and then also a little bit about my background and how I got into this field. So as mentioned, with this global movement of people, they're not all within refugee camps, or as we like to say, refugee settlements. In fact, most refugees don't live in settlements. They live in peri-urban areas or other parts of the community. Some live in urban areas in a variety of conditions, and as you can imagine also, in urban areas, most refugees lack the status to be able to buy and sell land and property for their children or their families to access health services and education services. So this chronic vulnerability limits the ability for refugees to actively participate in the economic context of the host country. So as I mentioned, around 75% of people don't live in refugee settlements, and that means about 25% do. And I'm mostly concerned with this particular population. So my job at UNHCR, I have around 11 staff in Geneva, and I have around 184 staff in the field. I currently have projects in 46 countries, and of the 12 or so million refugees, 25% being in refugee settlements, that's around 3.7 million people in around 225 settlements globally. Now that's just some rough data because of course the number of people on the move, moving in and moving out of settlements is really hard to assess and monitor and keep track of. So a lot of these are just global estimates. So as I mentioned, we're now encountering the highest numbers of displaced people on record. And I think another interesting piece of information to recognise is that the demographic of refugees globally is that of youth. Many are young. Also, apart from the refugee context, is statelessness. There's 10 million people that don't have nationality and can't access basic services. So this might fit everyone's idea of what a refugee settlement looks like, and that's probably true of a lot of the settlements in the Middle East at the moment. One point I'd like to make, and I'll come up again later on in the presentation, is the context of working in conflict and refugees is vastly different than working with natural disaster. After natural disaster, albeit a very complex environment, you find that there is some kind of linear process. There's a rapid onset disaster, everyone scrambles into an emergency phase, there's some kind of recovery process going on, and then a permanent reconstruction phase. One of the challenges of working in the refugee context is that there is no recovery in many cases. People stay in a state of chronic vulnerability and crisis for years and years. There's been many times in the last 17 or so years I've been doing this work that people have said to me, "My God, Brett, you're an architect. Can't you do a better job than this?" And I suppose I could. But the issue is not whether you do a tent or a mud brick house or a brick or some other kind of structure. We're working in a volatile and politically charged context. So it isn't about finding an architectural solution, it's about working within a context of complexity in a vastly different political landscape from country to country and place to place. The context of refugees can vary greatly from outright hostility to a relatively permissive environment. It depends on the host country and what the particular political arrangements are. And I'll come up more on that in a moment. So now more than ever, UNHCR is really at the coalface of trying to work with these complex intransigent issues. You might have seen in media recently that there are looming budget cuts. One of the main UN agencies that deals with reproductive rights and fertility is UNFPA, and they've been largely defunded. We're in a particularly vulnerable position, I must say, because of the $3.6 billion annually that is UNHCR's budget, 38% comes from the USA. So in terms of the global spread of what we refer to as persons of concern, it's a particular UN terminology that includes what we call IDPs, that is internally displaced people, and refugees. So if a disaster strikes here today and we all have to move to Sydney, God forbid, we would be called IDPs, internally displaced people. But if we all have to move to Indonesia or East Timor, we will be refugees. We wouldn't be citizens, and for us to access basic health, education and social services and other refugee rights is often a negotiated process. And in many cases, the obligations of states to live up to providing refugee rights is rarely met. Now, I don't know how clear the slide is from the back there, but really you can see the context of global displacement from refugees to IDPs, asylum seekers as well, and also returnees, statelessness and others. You can see some, I think I've got a pointer here, have I? Oh yeah, there we go. So up here, Colombia, the conflict with FARC that's been going on for decades and is still not completely resolved, has led to one of the largest IDP crises in the world in Colombia. Millions of people are displaced in Colombia. The biggest refugee hosting country in South America is Ecuador, hosting Colombian refugees. Here we see also, of course, the Horn of Africa, Yemen, and also around the Great Lakes. I have a huge number of projects at the moment in the Central African area. I've got dozens of staff in Nigeria right now dealing with the displacement caused by Boko Haram. And this Lake Chad Basin response, what we call, it is also covering Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and all the neighbouring countries. I think I mentioned to people in the course yesterday that, you know, one of the shocking statistics that I heard only a few weeks ago was when one of the protection officers came back from a mission to Nigeria, and they told me that in the one assessment that they did in a small town called Maiduguri in Borno State, northeastern Nigeria, was that there were 20,000 unaccompanied minors. That is, people under the age of 18 years old that are returning to their point of origin without parents or guardians. Also mentioned was that there was reported 8,000 cases of what we call SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence. So 8,000 women had reported sexual assault. And in the conservative Islamic context of that part of Nigeria, that is undoubtedly an underrepresentation of the atrocities that are currently going on there. So really, in UNHCR, we don't just kind of go to the field and do what we feel we need to do. We operate through a stringent policy context because the UN operates at a governmental level. We work according to our mandate and according to international humanitarian law. And in many ways, this leaves us a very slim margin to work within. There are only certain kinds of projects we can do in certain kinds of places, and it's all at the behest of the host government. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind. We don't have free reign. We don't have this tabula rasa where we can go in and do whatever we want, wherever we feel that we need to do it, and according to the needs that are identified on the ground. It's actually a much more complicated implementing environment, and we're constantly negotiating with the host government, also with the needs, the complicated needs of the refugee caseload, because in any one host country, you may have refugees from multiple countries. For example, the camps in Kenya, in northern Kenya, in Kakuma, we have people from Somalia, from Congo, from South Sudan, from various locations. Now, the other part of my job, apart from looking after the operations for the shelter and settlements program within UNHCR, is to co-lead what's called the Global Shelter Cluster. Now, I take on this role in partnership with IFRC, with the International Federation of the Red Cross. And the head of their shelter program, Ella, I work closely with her, and we have a team of about 40 people that are on the cluster coordination side of things. Now, just a brief history of the clusters is that in about 2004, 2005, what's called the IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee, which is the representatives, the humanitarian representatives of all the key global humanitarian NGOs and humanitarian UN agencies, came together and decided that there's got to be a better way of doing aid. They decided that there was, and rightfully so, that there was too much wasted effort, duplication of resources, overlapping of roles and responsibilities. So they said, let's reorganise the whole global framework for how we work in humanitarian contexts. And they came up with the transformative agenda, and within that, the cluster system. So they broke down all the regular sectors, and each of these are given to a particular UN agency or shared with a major global NGO to take lead of that particular sector. So you can see here shelter, and I co-lead this segment. Now, all the other global cluster co-leads, we meet in Geneva monthly, and we have an overview of the current emergency responses globally and work out where the resources are and what needs to be organised to make sure that there's a better response on the ground. At the moment, there's around 26 clusters that are active at country level. UNHCR leads 11 of them, and we lead the clusters in context of refugee and conflict cases. And here we are in Melbourne. So the question people often ask me is, how did you get into this work, and why are you even doing it? So I'll tell you a brief history of myself. These are mostly images of places I've worked in the last 15 years or so. Somalia, it's also Somalia. Northern Sri Lanka. So really, I don't want to just talk about myself. I'd rather talk about what I've been doing and how it links to us and what we can be doing and how we can relate to refugee issues and humanitarian issues at a global level. So my background is as an architect, and really soon after graduation, I worked in a small design firm in Collingwood. And I think, even though I wasn't ready to recognise it at the time, I think in hindsight, I knew after the first couple of years that I didn't really want to be doing big houses for rich people for the rest of my life. And I started getting more interested in social issues, issues of equity and justice. And could there be some kind of pathway from architecture through into human rights and politics? Is there a way we can weave these separate disciplines together and find some kind of pathway where you can feel effective? At that time, there wasn't really much of a pathway. I really just took one step after another and followed my nose and took some risks and went from country to country and project to project until really that's how my situation evolved. I started working with NGOs after volunteering in Vietnam in 2001. And then, although it was a horrific event for many, it was a lucky break for me, the tsunami. And I ended up going to northern Sri Lanka on a 6-month contract, but I stayed for 5 years. And I really, at that point, saw the full spectrum of humanitarian work from going from a post-disaster response situation back into conflict as the civil war in Sri Lanka erupted. At that time, I was working with World Vision, and then I left to join one of the UN agencies, UNOPS, United Nations Office of Project Services, and I was running an office for them in the middle of the Tamil Tiger-held area, a small town called Kilinochchi. So that was my first real foray into working conflict. And the distinction between conflict and humanitarian contexts, natural disaster, soon became apparent. I was lucky enough to get another 5 years with them, then back with World Vision for another 4.5 years as their global shelter infrastructure and reconstruction advisor. And that led me to many emergency responses in many countries, more than 20 countries in the last 15 years, and most of my time getting on and off of planes. Luckily, a year and a half or 2 years ago, I'd applied for a break. I'd had enough of humanitarian world and needed to take a step back and see what other shape life could take and to kind of rethink and reassess things. And I was lucky enough, with Esther being a fine referee for me, to be awarded a fellowship at Harvard. So I spent 12 months at Harvard, and that was a wonderful experience. And in the words of the coordinator of the Loeb Fellowship, you have free reign of the university, which was quite true. You could do any course at Harvard, any course at MIT, and that really gave me a chance to step back and rethink the kind of ways I was working and how I was engaging, what my professional capacities were or were not, and try and work on some of these things and get a better, well-rounded package between your work life, your academic life, your personal life, and see what kind of pathway you can take and what kind of skills you could develop. So that was a very fortunate sabbatical year for me. And then I began working with UNHCR in August of last year, which does mean you have to live in Geneva if you're working for UNHCR. So a role for us. So how do we, working and living in Melbourne, really respond to the needs of people in developing countries? Do we have a way of actually doing it from afar? Or do you need to throw away everything and go and live in a village in Africa for 15 years? I used to think that was probably the case, that you did have to do that, but now of course not. There's a lot of professional development pathways, and the linkages between the developed and the developing world are now very, very close. There's pockets of underdevelopment in every developed country and pockets of high levels of development even in the poorest parts of the developing world. So the picture is not clear-cut. It's complicated and it's nuanced and heavily reliant on technologies as well. So there's a clear role where we can work in emergencies, we can work in transitional kind of aspects, and also around post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. And I now think there's some clear and evident established entry points for architects and built environment professionals more generally to work in that space. But really, apart from that, it's about knowing how the humanitarian system works. And there's no easy way of knowing that. There's no one book or there's no set of rules. You've got to either dip your toe in the in the water or dive in deeper and find out how that goes. But one thing that I have certainly learned is that it's important to develop skills to work in multidisciplinary teams. We have to understand more about how health programs work, education programs work, child protection, good governance. The full scope of multi-sector programming is important to understand, or any kind of shelter or settlement intervention that you propose will be very limited in scope, depth and applicability. I also think it's critical to have more non-humanitarians working in the humanitarian sector. And I mean the private sector and academics. It's no longer adequate to have academics or evaluators coming in 1 or 2 years after a project and doing an evaluation and telling you everything that went wrong. It's too late. We need more real-time evaluation, and that then requires stronger evidence-based and data to work with. So humanitarians need to start, and they have started, but to better grasp best practice from developed country contexts and vice versa. I also see a stronger role for the private sector because the complexities of fieldwork these days are that we need strong professional skills working across a range of contexts and a range of countries. And are humanitarian needs that different? And in the end, I think not. The basic aspects are, of course, after disaster and after displacement, you need food, water and shelter. It's the delivery of these basics which is where the complexity lies. And one thing that's become clear to me now is that it's much more about process over product. How you do something is often much more important than what you do. If you're working in a complicated rural environment in Africa or a camp context in Iraq or Syria, as I'll show you later on, how you do even the simplest shelter project varies greatly from context to context, depending on the particular stakeholders that you're working with. Often you're working in a situation of complicated relationships of ethnic minorities and religious minorities, and you need to know how to work in that context. And that develops over time and with experience. I also now see the role and, the working in conflict as a specific context. And as I mentioned before, protracted crisis especially is a certain constrained political environment to work within. So you need to really have innovative solutions and creative approaches to work within that context. Here's a picture from Uganda. So as I mentioned, since July last year, 1.2 million people have been displaced in, what would it be, 9 months, 10 months? We've got about 650,000 that have crossed the border from South Sudan into Uganda. And this wave of people come not in a continuous and predictable number. It can be very unpredictable. 25,000 people arrive in 1 week. Sometimes we've had 8,000 arriving in 1 day. So how do you cope with that? What kind of skills do you need? It's more than just being an architect or an engineer or a doctor or a nurse or a human rights lawyer. You need more than that. You need to think across disciplines and develop connected skills that can think through these challenges. So how do you plan a settlement in this context? I'll take you through 2 particular steps now. How we're working at the global level. As I mentioned, there's around 230 or so planned settlements. So how do we plan them? In this vastly complicated environment where people are coming in unpredictable numbers, how do you work with that context of uncertainty? So we have some strategic objectives that we work with, 2 in particular. The first thing we always ensure is to try to minimise the risk of conflict between the host community and the refugees. As mentioned, in many countries, refugees are not that welcome. But in some countries they are. And the example here of Uganda is one of a fair degree of acceptance. This also is conditional really upon the context of working in Africa. In many cases, as many of you all know who've worked there or travelled there, that particular ethnic groups and tribal affiliations cross national boundaries. A boundary doesn't mean much. Often the boundaries are new. They might have only been there 10 or 20 or 30 years. And the ethnic makeup of a certain region could be centuries old. So the borders in many parts of Africa are permeable, and refugees cross back and forward depending on the context. So we have to work within this local cultural context to find the kind of solutions that we need. We always favour integration as well. This is important to know that we never establish a refugee settlement as a first resort. According to UNHCR principles, it's always a last resort. The first thing you do is always encourage return to place of origin so long as it's voluntary and safe to do so. The second option is integration with local community, and often they can have a financial incentive to do that, offering rent or so forth, so that people can live in more of a home-based and protective environment when it's culturally appropriate to do so. And the last option, when those first two are not possible, is to establish a settlement. The other big part for me really is about changing the narrative. This is true in every country. How can refugees be of benefit to the host community? There is an uninformed perception out there that refugees sap resources of the host community. I don't have enough for me, how can I have enough to give to someone else? Now, this is proven to be untrue across a variety of measures, from economic to education to health. So we need to change the narrative. And that really is up to all of us to understand these details and work out where the fallacies in these perceptions are. We need to change the narrative and really build up a common understanding that how can shared resources benefit both populations, as well as foster a more sustainable solution, to look at it in the long term. I'll just take you through a couple of slides from master planning now and how we look at this in planning out a refugee community. So we look at the space. We look at a more integrated settlement planning process. We look at the best of urban planning processes within an emergency context, and therein lies the tension. So why do a master plan? It's a key part of our strategy, and as I said, we work through a strategic approach. It's now very evident that our current emergency practices really are limited in terms of the long-term issues. We have emergency planning processes, but we now know that the average lifespan of a refugee settlement is 17 up to 26 years. So how can you have an emergency plan settlement that lingers for so long? I mean, in the end, it's obvious we're building new towns. And in many ways, we're probably the biggest urban designer in the world without even knowing it. So we're looking at sustainability, management of natural resources, and really to further connect humanitarian and development approaches. There's been a lot of shifts at a global level, part of which have come out from what we call the Grand Bargain, which was the outcome of the World Humanitarian Summit last year, and also Habitat 3, which I attended in Ecuador last November. We need a common vision and a strategy, and holistic ways to look at multi-sector planning and implementation, all through a spatial framework where we're dealing with landscape and proximity. So the principles really are how to design or upgrade a settlement as if you were planning it to be permanent, and aligning as much as possible to the local and regional development plans so it's integrated. And really, how do we design to maximise social cohesion And this is all the more complicated in urban areas. So I'll take you through this example of Uganda very quickly. So I had staff 3 weeks ago go across to Uganda because the office had requested assistance to establish a new settlement at a place called Lumwo, where they were expecting up to 80,000 people within the next couple of months. The blue circles show Adjumani, Yumbe, Moyo and Arua. Some of these settlements have been here for more than 20 years. But we now have a new influx coming across, as I mentioned. This is a comparison of Lumwo and 3 other commonly known contexts which you may have heard of. Dadaab, the second one, which is on the border of Somalia and Kenya. At one time, this was the biggest refugee settlement in the world, but has now been largely depopulated by the Kenyan government with forced returns, that is, refoulement, back into Somalia, and forced relocation to northern Kenya to Kakuma camp. So we've got the same population in these 3 locations. You can see a high density in Kakuma and Kalabay. And where we're working here in Western Nile area in Uganda, it's 380 square kilometres. It's very hard to plan out such a huge area. Some just quick overview of some of the data we're working with there and how the planning process moved forward. Incorporation of social infrastructure, healthcare, primary schools, security, police posts. Looking through the site analysis, making sure we're creating plot ratios and density that are acceptable within the local host community population as well, because we're promoting the sharing of resources, the sharing of agricultural inputs as well, and minimum interruption to the landscape. Usable land area allocated around 28%. So we go forward with a planning process there, planning according to the topography and trying to emulate the traditional development of African villages as much as possible. So rather than having one large camp where everyone gets a number 1 to 20,000, we've broken it up into smaller village-like components. And that's also reflective of the ethnic composition of the displaced community as well. They can form extended family groups. So we do a lot of local level analysis, site, topography, and plan out in conjunction with the displaced community and the host community and local government, 4 parties to the process. Then we start looking at the shelter options. What's local? How much does it cost? Where are the skills? Who knows how to build? How will we actually start building thousands of small houses? When I started working in Africa, I always found it amazing that we would end up using the tukul, the traditional tukul. This is common in kind of East Africa, South Sudan, Uganda. And I realized when I started watching people build them that the reason why they're round and with a conical roof is that they're quite easy to build. You don't have to cut the rafters or the purlins. Every piece of timber is the same length. You can pack it up and move it and reassemble the roofing structure, and it doesn't matter what order you put the timber up in because it's all the same length. So it's actually a very efficient building to build. You can see the cost analysis there as well. So one of the other main features that, if anyone's ever been to a UNHCR camp, is the ubiquitous white plastic with blue logo. UNHCR procure around 70 to 100,000 tents a year and 2.5 million square metres of plastic. So it is one of the main building materials. It's very efficient in the midst of an emergency, and you can get tents out very quick, but of course they don't make good long-term habitation for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So we're developing a variety of strategies of moving away from the traditional tent, We've got one in partnership called the Refugee Housing Unit with the IKEA Foundation. It's under development. So I'll just quickly go through the rest of Uganda, and now I'll jump onto Syria, which is a context which you'll probably all be familiar with from the media, but maybe not so familiar with of what is actually going on there in terms of shelter projects. We work through partners, and we've responded to more than 100,000 people there. Here are the places we're working: Damascus, Aleppo, new projects open up in Homs and Latakia. So we've got some traditional tent-based approaches, and then also we're working within urban contexts. So we've been making any kind of public space habitable that's possible. Mosques, warehouses, cleaning up warehouses and fitting them out to individual family units. But of course, this kind of project is complicated because of two things. One, because of the damage, and also because of these buildings not being established as shelter. They're warehouses, they're factories. So they don't have adequate light, ventilation, heating, or cooling. And in many cases, people will take care of themselves and find themselves in very dangerous situations. I mean, clearly you can see here, one more shell and this roof will come down. We retrofit existing unfinished buildings and work with landlords to try to get some simple repairs and finishes done and negotiate rental agreements and payments as well. So a lot of our urban shelter program is around rental subsidies as much as it is architectural. Fitting out showers and kitchens, rubble removal. UNHCR was the first agency in Aleppo after the liberation. This is the citadel, which was occupied. Working in the complicated environment with armed forces, government, complications of trying to work safely, structural issues. For anyone who recognises that, that was the souk in Aleppo. Some of you may have been there. Cultural heritage and religious infrastructure heavily damaged. Renovation of warehouses into living spaces. And the main challenges here really, as mentioned, access, security, monitoring what's going on when you can't get to watch the projects face to face, capacity of partners. And the overall complex context really is around the short time frames, political issues, social and cultural issues. Let's go back. The physical complexity of an urban environment and lack of resources. So what are the future challenges really? We know that the world population is urbanising rapidly. In the context of climate change, reduction in funding, capacity gaps, and constant cycle of displacement and conflict. This is the typical camp that you may be familiar with, Zaatari in Jordan, but this is not normal. This is a very expensive camp and well supported by Gulf states. Most settlements don't look like this. This is the anomaly more than the rule. This is a good image of some of the Syrian refugees actually moving the shelters around. So no matter what the design process, in the end, people will take over, and that's great. They'll customise things, rearrange them to reflect local needs, family considerations, and that's important. So that's the link between the planners and the people. And as I mentioned, working across disciplines, humanitarian approach. I'll finish up my presentation now, and for the last kind of points, I want to read them because I've taken some notes and I think it's a bit more succinct if I can read the last paragraph. So Syria. It's multidimensional and it's a global crisis. It has far-reaching implications that reach well past the Middle East, and it's reshaping geopolitics. The Syria crisis is just one aspect of an era of chronic fragility that we may be just at the beginning of, where globalisation, climate change are two key drivers in the context of global displacement, and much of it forced. The role of technology is important, and understanding resilience on a personal and family level also, as well as for our communities. Chronic conflict. We must try to develop skills to work within these protracted situations. And protection of civilians. The idea of the benevolent state is actually not true in all cases. In many cases, the state is the perpetrator of violence, the source of malevolence. But the story is not one of despair or hopelessness, but it is one of challenge. There are many stories of refugees finding brilliant ways to support themselves and others. If you check the UNHCR website, you'll find many of these stories. But for me, it's a story of complexity. Are we up for the job? Do we as citizens and professionals have the capacity to understand and find meaningful inroads into working with these global challenges? As I mentioned to Esther earlier, I heard Naomi Klein speak last week when I was attending a conference in the US at Harvard. And although she spoke of various environmental challenges and the political barriers to get real action on climate change, she said something that stuck with me, and that was all issues are important. We can't stop working on refugee issues while we tackle climate change or deal with domestic political issues first. In the end, it's all connected, and you have to understand how the connections exist. It's people, it's histories, shared and individual, it's land, it's climate, it's economics, it's politics. And in the end, it's about justice and participation. Another speaker at the conference I attended said, all architecture and planning schools need to have compulsory course on disasters. Then another one replied, they need to have a compulsory course on politics. And maybe they're right. And maybe this is the way that our RMIT is heading. And if the MoDDD degree is an example, it's truly critical for us to be thinking outside of our own disciplines, our own education, being outside of our comfort zones and working across boundaries. I mentioned in the conference that when we need legal advice, we go to a lawyer. When we need medical advice, we go to seek the services of a doctor. When we need advice about humanitarian issues, do we go to a humanitarian professional? No, not yet. Because the field's evolving, and in the end, it encompasses all disciplines, and it's up to us to be versed across these disciplines and develop a broad expertise, but also to know how to truly collaborate with others, as no single discipline has all the answers. As a final word, I hope I've been able to provide some food for thought and help us think about the linkages across various aspects of humanitarian work and how shelter plays a critical role in achieving protection and development outcomes. And also clearly there's much more that still needs to be done as the numbers of forcibly displaced people around the world tragically continues to grow. I hope you now have a better understanding of UNHCR, what it does, but also what some of the limitations of the UN system are, and how in the end it is active and engaged citizens that can help find the answers necessary to build peace, to have the skills to work in complex humanitarian contexts and to work with others as partners. On a personal level, it's my goal that we can all have the empathy and the compassion, as well as the energy and the motivation that are the main resources a humanitarian needs to build the collective capacity to keep responding, to keep working with the most vulnerable, to in the end help ensure that nobody's left outside. So thank you.
Great presentation. I'm really glad it wasn't all about architecture because I was really outside my comfort zone when it comes to architecture. This is an unfamiliar setting for me, so I'm going to have to make it up as I go. I hope that's all right. I guess that's what UNHCR has to do a lot of the time. I'm interested in the idea of the role for civic engagement. I think it's a very important consideration that we all need to think about as members of this political entity, which is expressing its attitudes to the rest of the world by the way we respond to other people's disasters. Now, I was interested at the foundation of your talk, Brett. A disaster is a natural aspect of being alive. You know, we all face disasters from time to time, some of us more, some of us less. Design, very important, it appeals to our instinctive appreciation of the aesthetic. And shelter, what could be more basic than the need for shelter? Shelter, food and water, as you pointed out several times. These are basic needs which we need to understand. Other people need those things just as much as we need those things. What are we doing in fact? I mean, you saw the images. You saw the images of places like Aleppo being destroyed. You saw the numbers. We think of refugees as people who've been assessed somewhere else and get shipped over here to be looked after. In other places in the world, they think of refugees as people who are fleeing across the border, people who are coming from Syria in enormous numbers. We don't seem to appreciate that is the reality of people who are seeking help. What do we do to them? Well, we throw them off to Pacific Islands, and then we make it almost impossible for the public to be embarrassed by learning what is actually going on there. I wonder how many people in this room are aware of the fact that Nauru, which was the first place of offshore incarceration, I guess is an accurate word, Nauru, where we throw the boat people who we do not want to help or resettle in this country. Nauru has a land area smaller than Tullamarine Airport. Australia has a land area which is really quite big, even if you only concentrate on the coastal fringe. Nauru and Manus are both characterised by this. They are both places that need money, and we give them that. They are both places where the locals are hostile to the people we send there, and they are both places in which the people who have been sent there by force, by us, are treated with hostility, indifference and neglect. They're neglected by us and they're treated with hostility by the locals. More people have been shot to death in Manus Island than have been resettled by Australia. More people have... Why do we do it? Why do we do it? Because of an ostensible humanitarian concern about people drowning in their attempt to reach safety. This myth, which is designed to make us feel more comfortable, is contradicted by the simple logic of the thing, if only you can think about it. What happens if people don't get on a boat from Indonesia, which hasn't signed the Refugees Convention, by the way, where people are not safe if they stay there in their attempt to seek safety? If they don't get on a boat, what do they face? They face the prospect of being jailed in Indonesia, or possibly sent back to the place where they were being persecuted. What happens if they don't leave the place where they're being persecuted? What happens if they get killed by their persecutors? Well, they're still dead, just as if they drowned. Will we know about it? No, we won't. The difference is that our conscience feels better. Remember, last year I think it was, a guy called Omid Masumali on Nauru set himself alight. He and his family had been assessed on Nauru as refugees. They were told that Australia would never allow them to come here. They were desperate at the idea that they might have to spend an indefinite number of years in Nauru, where they are hated by the locals. And so in desperation, Omid Masumali, an assessed refugee, publicly doused himself with lighter fluid and set himself on fire. He died. Cathy Wilcox, a cartoonist who captures the truth more accurately and succinctly than most people, Cathy Wilcox did a cartoon the next day of a man engulfed in flames, and the caption read, "Not drowning." that really tells the whole story. If they don't die where we see it, we won't care if they die somewhere else. We need to care. That's why the response of countries adjacent to Syria are a lesson to all of us. The numbers in Jordan, 665,000 refugees in Jordan. Jordan has a population of 8 million people. Just imagine, that's 1/3 of us. Imagine if we got 1.8 million boat people coming to Australia instead of the present annual total of 0 and the medium-term average of a couple of thousand a year. Just imagine if we had 1.8 million boat people here. That would be the equivalent of what Jordan has. In Lebanon, 28% of the population now are refugees from Syria. Just imagine how we would react if that was the position in Australia. The images which Brett showed us are really important. In particular, I thought the images of Aleppo and its destruction, which we're all familiar with, and the image of the flooding, which I thought might be Sri Lanka, although I wasn't sure. It was Sri Lanka? Good. Those images help drive home to us the need to respond decently to people in distress. It's worth remembering that the main difference between the world's present response to refugees and the response after World War II is a difference of empathy. It's not a difference of scale. It is true that the number of refugees and internally displaced people now is greater than it was at the end of World War II. But the population of the world is about 3 times greater now than it was at the end of World War II. Proportionally, we have a smaller problem than we did at the end of the Second World War. But at the end of the Second World War, there was a very interesting response. The interesting response was generated largely by Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of the President of the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt decided that the world needed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and she drove that process. She was a remarkable woman. The preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights includes the observation that if the world was responding with outrage at events which had outraged the conscience of mankind, and that if the world was to be spared similar events in the future, it was essential that they all recognise that all human beings have equal rights, and the Universal Declaration sets out those rights. We were one of the active driving forces behind the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we seem to have forgotten the essential message of that document. One of the reasons that we have forgotten that message, I think, is because we've lost our capacity for empathy. The Universal Declaration was driven in large measure by the appalling images of the German concentration camps, in particular Belsen, which I think was the first concentration camp liberated by the Americans, and later Auschwitz and Dachau, which many people in this room will have visited. The images from those places were so shocking that the whole world drew breath in horror that these things could happen. We seem to have forgotten that. We now seem to live in an age where, in the cocoon that we call Australia, we're isolated from that sort of reality. Every now and then we'll see images from Aleppo and think, oh, wouldn't that be terrible? But are we helping Syrian refugees? Not in any big number. In January, I was in Scotland. Scotland has a population of about 5 million people, a little bit, around about the same as Sydney. In the 12 months up to January of this year, Scotland had resettled more than 1,000 Syrian refugees. Quite a big effort considering their relatively small size. Now, I managed to speak to a number of people at various levels of government in Scotland when I was there, and I told them briefly what Australia was doing and how slack we've been in relation to boat people and Syrian refugees in particular. And I asked them what accounts for the difference in response. And all of them said, in substance, and a few of them said in actual words, they're human beings. They need help. Can you imagine any politician in Australia responding like that to the plight of refugees who come here? I mean, how extraordinary. You know, for UNHCR, this is everyday stuff. Of course, your work is based on the idea that these are human beings and we have to do what we can do. But in Australia, it has become politically impossible to say something like, these are human beings, they need help. We would all wish that if we were unfortunate enough to be in their circumstances, someone else would say, that's a human being, they need our help. Let me challenge you with this idea. I've now totally lost track of what I was going to say. Oh, actually, that's an interesting bit. No, I was going to divert myself onto some history. The history of human rights abuses is really quite interesting. One story which really interests me a lot comes from about 1780, I think. A ship called the Zorg. It was a slave trader, and it had collected its cargo of slaves from the east coast of Africa and was headed across to America. And it got becalmed. This was a time when Wilberforce, in his anti-slavery thing, was gaining some traction in England, although other people said that the whole financial success of the United Kingdom depended on a maintenance of the slave trade. Anyway, the Zorg got becalmed, and it was becalmed for quite a long time until the captain, Captain Collingwood, became concerned about the prospect of the ship running out of food and water before it could reach America. So he threw 133 living slaves overboard so as to reduce the demand for food and water. I like to think that it is almost impossible for such a thing to happen these days, although my confidence sometimes drains away when I listen to people like Peter Dutton expressing his opinions. Interestingly, and this is just a footnote, the conduct of Captain Collingwood ended up in court in London, not on a charge of mass murder, but on an insurance claim. The insurance company said the market value of slaves had fallen below the insured value, and so they rejected the claim for the loss of the slaves who'd been thrown overboard. But the other thought that came to mind is a little closer to the present than the Zorg, and that is the famous Jericho painting, The Raft of the Medusa. It is not widely remembered that the Raft of the Medusa, which Jericho painted in, I think, 1818, reflected a genuine state of affairs, not very different from the Zorg. There was a ship that got into trouble, and the captain put quite a number of people onto a raft. The ship was the Medusa. They cobbled together a raft, and the captain put a number of people on the raft with minimal supplies and set them adrift. And anyone who sees that painting immediately responds with horror, because Jericho managed to capture the humanity of the people who'd been cast adrift this way. The painting caused an immediate response in France when it was first shown. It's in the Louvre, of course, and it is a reminder of something which I think Brett reminded us of tonight, that you have to respond with empathy to the people who come quietly, modestly asking for help. The rest of the world is trying more or less hard. Australia is falling way behind. So, Brett, thank you for talking about that subject rather than talking just about architecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett and Julian, for some incredible insights. Of course, we are situated within the Design Hub, so we have some funky chairs down here. And we have been debating in MoDDD whether the camp planning skills of UNHCR couldn't be better used in this building, but right. we won't go there. Anyway, I'd like to now hand over to you, the audience, no doubt who are burning with some questions. I know Julian will get a parking fine if he's not out by 7:10. So I'll be...
And it is a basic human right not to pay parking fines.
So please put up your hand, and if you can say your question quite loudly, that would be great.
Sure. So you better summarise that for the rest of the audience.
Okay. Okay. mic's working. No, thanks, Charles. It's interesting, I think, the role that landscape plays as a discipline and also in practice. There's been a project with UNHCR for the last 4 years, and before I arrived here on Tuesday, I spent all of last week in the States. And one of the reasons I went there for was for a conference, but I was also in New York, and I had a meeting with a firm called Ennead Architects. And they're a big firm in the West Village, and they've been working with UNHCR for 4 years on developing what's called a toolkit called Rethinking Refugee Communities. And that was a series of tools and processes to try to work with the landscape, to work with the topography, natural resource management, and try and basically minimise the harm that the traditional approach of refugee settlements had done to the environment. Because for 40 or more years of doing settlements, the traditional approach has really been to bulldoze everything, flatten the landscape, put up a grid, number it 1 to 100,000, and if you're number 598, you put your tent there, and you may stay there for years. So there'd been an acknowledgement that the long-term impact of refugee settlements was particularly damaging. So what we're going to do about it? How do you put in some better long-term planning approaches amidst the short-term pressures of emergency response? So it's trying to balance those two worlds, but I think we've got a much better result now. And just to kind of add in a bit of technical detail, we got a $2 million donation from the AutoCAD Foundation. And they developed a customised software approach, which is a mix of AutoCAD, Civil 3D, and InfraWorks 360. So it's a dynamic landscape modelling approach where we can look at density and change a whole lot of factors with, students would know this, a grasshopper plugin. So it's a parametric design process. So it's really quite interesting. So now we've got a standardised software, hardware, and then a training approach as well. So I've had 2 trainings last year, bringing a bunch of staff from Africa and the Middle East into these new approaches and to try to kind of mainstream it throughout how we do things. So, yeah.
Can I add one little note to that? And it may sound cynical because it is. And that is, it's really interesting and encouraging to hear architects explicitly recognising that the things that use their product are human beings.
Yes, architecture is not just a piece of abstract sculpture in the landscape. So.
I was interested in what you said about evaluation, about it happening 2 years later, which is always too late for an evaluation. Do you not have action research methodologies embedded into what you do so you're constantly evaluating? I mean, I know you're in the middle of a disaster, but you can embed these things. No, you don't? Or
no, we do.
You do?
There's a lot of evaluation that goes in place, but most of the evaluation is done internally, or it's subcontracted out at the end of the process. I don't think there's a close enough involvement of academics at the right point in the process.
Not academics.
Well,
it's the people that are involved. That's how you do it.
Now we have a strong
Like
monitoring and evaluation process, and also what we have now inbuilt is a fairly detailed accountability process. So there's various kinds of committee-based approaches within the refugee settlements themselves for people to have representation. And a lot of it's anonymous feedback as well, because when you're working in conflicted environments, freedom of speech is not easy to come by. And it's very hard for people to put forward their grievances in front of others. So we're trying to incorporate a whole lot of different approaches around that. I can only really speak for my side of things as well, on the shelter and settlement side. There's quite different working in health or education, or other kinds of project approaches too. I think it's sorely underexplored. And I'm only really saying this because I spent quite a bit of time during my experience at Harvard with someone who comes from an urban design background and was heavily into creative placemaking. And they really opened my eyes to the potential for that. I think one of the limitations is that the humanitarians are caught in this kind of only a basic approach of essential services, then anything more than that is seen as being luxurious. And not saying that public art is necessarily luxurious, but for people that come from that humanitarian background, they don't see things on a holistic kind of urban lens. I have been approached by two artists, one based in the States, and she does a lot of participatory art and kind of suspended tensile structures. And she was wanting to do two pieces in Jordan. But because of local government permissions, they didn't go ahead. But I do think that it's really underexplored. It does work currently in small interventions, say within schools, and getting children to work, in some ways in decorating in schools and public buildings, but nothing much more than that. So I agree with you. I think it's something that should be encouraged more.
Can I just butt in and put a question to Julian? Brett, in your talk you raised the issue that working on these kind of complex emergencies should be sort of part of basic undergraduate, design education. Julian, do you see it in the same grounds for lawyers, that human rights law should sort of be a 101 of legal education? I mean, there is a much stronger tradition in the legal profession of pro bono law services. It's very marginal in the design sphere, but how do you see that? I mean, you're juggling all the time these sort of two worlds.
I think the unfortunate fact is that we have a legal system, the objective of which is to result in justice. We don't have a justice system. Law students are taught law, they're not taught justice. That's what we need.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, just here. Yeah. Could you... microphone's coming. We'll just take two more questions and then there are...
Hello?
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in your mention of interdisciplinary teams, and then also sort of the idea that you're speaking about making humanizing people. And I was wondering what sort of systems you have in place to not have the same sorts of backgrounds talking about an issue that might not pertain directly to them. So, like how, when you say you arrive in a place after some sort of conflict or disaster, how you build a team not just to reflect how you've seen things to be, but to have voices from certain communities in that. And also, it kind of ties in with speaking about art, because sort of thinking about the idea that we'd want artists to go, sort of Western developed country artists to go places and create art based on that. But instead of that, sort of systems for uplifting people who are already there.
Okay.
Or refugees, yeah.
No, I understand what you mean. No, it's a broad question, but I do understand what you mean. I think it took me quite a few years of doing humanitarian work before I really started to understand multidisciplinarity in a kind of true sense. And I remember when it happened. I remember being in Somalia. And I was back and forth to Somalia for a couple of years. And it's a particularly complicated context. In fact, I did a lecture about it last week, and it was the whole idea of conflict and the absent state. How do you work in countries where there is no functioning government? If government is there to provide the legislative space within which you work, they give you land permits and permission to build, and they provide the kind of structure within which projects are implemented. When that doesn't exist, how do you work through clan-based authorities, tribal groups and others that may not have elected positions or have the authority to grant those kinds of permissions? So I was really confronted in that context of finding ways to work to get some kind of meaningful solution. And it was also the first time when I really started looking at the way that education specialists or social workers or health workers, they work with groups in a vastly different way than architects do. Architects are still taught in a fairly conventional way of having client, and the client provides the money and the project and you implement that, and local government provide the authoritative framework within which the project works, and you engage sub-consultants. But if you're working with social workers, health workers, education workers, they work with groups in quite a different way than architects. And so it became very apparent to me to really pull back on the heavy project management side of things. Architects are taught to mobilise resources from an idea through to a finished product and build a coalition around that. But in complicated and multi-ethnic working environments, we have clans, sub-clans, people are armed. How do you work through the exertion of authority through those kinds of groups? And you really have to work as an enabler, as a facilitator, and bring groups together and let ideas come up, and then they can take the process forward. So you're there to move a process, but not control it and not lead it. It's a really different way of working that took me a long time to kind of understand that.
Can I chip in on that?
Sorry, can we have
Your question and your earlier answer both brought to mind the desirability of there being a genuine aesthetic sensitivity in what is done in architecture. What we can overlook is the really powerful human desire for something that appeals to our aesthetic instinct. Art, I guess, is the generic umbrella term for it. And if refugee architecture is purely utilitarian, if it ignores the human need for aesthetic nourishment, then it could be seen as insulting. And so I think design principles, picking up on your question, I think design principles are really, really important, but in ways that go way beyond anything that a private client might want.
That's right, absolutely.
Just the last question here.
Thank you. Cliff Overton from Yarra Ranges Council, so thanks for the playground plug. You touched on it briefly at the beginning of your presentation, Brett, about the challenges you have with funding in the future, and pointing to the US and its resources provided to you. I'm wondering how what's your plan B in relation to sort of this emergence towards a right-wing politics and its response to the refugee crisis we see from Africa into Europe, and how countries are now responding with political strength and political voice more to the right-wing isolationist views. How does that sit with you and in the future and the challenges you face?
Yeah. I think that all humanitarian organisations need to find a vastly different way to work, and that will be not through design, it'll be by default, and it's coming soon. I think that the main agencies really need to work in partnership in a vastly different way, and it's coming. It hasn't probably come fast enough. I do think too that there are gaps that should be filled by the private sector. It shouldn't just be up to governments and the traditional global donors to support humanitarian causes. Why can't the huge wealth of global corporations? Now that we're in a situation of globalisation, the wealth of corporations is now more than many African countries. And so why can't these large entities take on the role of donor? If they're willing to take on the role of accumulating global capital, they should take on some of the social responsibility that goes with that as well, I think. It's one part of me that thinks that. But I also think that fundamental reform of the humanitarian system needs to take place. It is taking place. It's taking place slowly. But I think that that'll also come much faster than a lot of humanitarians currently expect.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that?
Please.
I think it's a very important question, and I agree with your answer. I think there is a problem that we have simply forgotten the lessons of the past. Churchill famously said the one thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. The shock that generated great generosity across the world in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War is now disappearing because we are not responding with the same shock to things which are almost equally shocking, because it all comes to us processed and sanitised through the fake news media.
Well, it's hard to say anything after such profound thoughts and insights from both Brett and Julian tonight. So thank you both so much for making the time. Brett from coming from Geneva, and Julian again.
Coming from Queen Street.
No. but I sort of dragging you into a lot of architecture events because people tend to get a bit bored of architects, but not Brett. So just three people I want to thank. Anna, who's outside, who is the engine behind MoDD, Scott from marketing, and most of all to the MoDD students here tonight, mostly all sitting in the fourth row there, I think, because they're the engine and rationale and why we have these events. And it's your aspirations to transition to a career in the humanitarian sector that has made these questions and these discussions valuable. So thanks so much to all of you. It's been quite a long week. So let's just please give a round of applause for Brett and for Julian.